Daniil Dubov is a really dangerous blitz player. Sitting inside the top 10 in the world, he always proves a formidable opponent. And so when Firouzja paired him in the penultimate round of the 2021 Blitz, we knew we'd see fireworks on the board. So Dubov opened up with this King's Indian attack, a very solid way of playing, but without pushing the pawn to c4 here, as we note. So both players castled now, pawn to d6 from Firouzja, and now pawn to a4 from Dubov. He starts this advance of the rook's pawn. Sometimes this can be a good strategy to immediately activate the rook, although you are losing time here playing on the flank of the board. And in the meantime, Firouzja plays the knight into the centre. We had pawn to a5 and pawn to c6. So Firouzja's countering this flank attack by playing in the centre, which is often very good strategically. And you don't want to waste yet another move here as white going pawn to a6, because then b5 would come, gaining space on the queen side, and possibly this pawn will actually be weak later on. So instead of this, Dubov now plays pawn to b3. So he's seeking to develop the queen side like this, but it's a bit of a dodgy move because you make these dark squares really weak now on the queen side, and yet again you're moving pawns and neglecting to develop your minor pieces. We had pawn to e5 now from Firouzja, good move striking in the centre, pawn captures, pawn retakes, and now knight f to d2, again neglecting development here and moving the same piece twice in the opening, always a dodgy thing to do. And now we had pawn to e4, a really good move, opening up this bishop immediately, and it kind of prevents actually the normal development of the bishop to b2, because if you do play like this, now we have pawn to e3, and this is just ruining the white pawn structure here. Even though you give a pawn, if white captures that, this one will be recaptured at a later point, and black gets really big play now with knight to d5. So instead of developing the bishop to b2 here, Dubov goes knight to c4, preventing that pawn push. Now we had knight to d5, centralising that knight, opening up the bishop, and here the rook moves up to a4. Arguably better was just going bishop to b2 here, because although after takes you're displacing this knight, at least you've gotten this dangerous g7 bishop off the board. But instead of this, we had the rook coming up to here, to a4 now, and it prevents knight b4, which is perhaps why it was played, but after knight c5, you're giving yet another tempo on the rook. Now maybe it should have come to a3 here, but after queen e7, black already has a huge position. This queen is x-raying the rook, which makes it hard to develop the queen side harmoniously, and it also supports the e4 pawn. Maybe you'll play f5 soon. Really nice position for black. So instead the rook dropped back to a2, but now knight b4 comes, further tempo on the rook, and here Dubov actually decides to just chuck the exchange by playing bishop to a3. So Firouzja chops the queens first, the rook recaptures, and now he takes this rook on a2, and it unlocks the bishop now to take on c5. We had rook to e8, and bishop takes on e4 now. A nice tactic, taking advantage of the fact that the rook can't take here, because otherwise we have check on the back rank, bishop to f8, and this is really bad for black. So coming back here, after the bishop took on e4, we had bishop to h3. Now these rooks are connected with this move, and we also set up a nice bind against the king, and that's why the bishop actually dropped back here, looking to exchange those. Firouzja could have taken this one, and after the king recaptures, you win a pawn here. Good way to play, but he actually sought to just keep some tension, keep up the pressure by playing bishop to g4 here. So more pressure here. You can't push the pawn or you lose your rook. If you play bishop to f3, then this doesn't look so great for white after this capture and doubling the pawns. And if you play pawn to f3, well, now you're blocking this bishop out of the game, plus you open up this line to your king, which is never desirable in blitz. So instead of this, Dubov plays for counterplay with pawn to a6, seeking to undermine this structure, but Firouzja just calmly goes pawn to b6, not going in for the complications of taking on e2 because there's just no need. And now the bishop is attacked here. You don't have time to take here because after takes, this is just bad for white. So the bishop drops back here, and now we had bishop takes on e2. The rook slides up the board, the bishop captures on c4, pawn recaptures, and now rook a to c8 just calmly holds this pawn which was attacked by the bishop. And now white has to somehow develop this knight which is still stranded back at home. You want to put it on c3, but that's controlled by two pieces. And if you come to a3, it just looks really miserable here, stuck on the side of the board. So Dubov goes pawn to c3 instead, and although this gives a pawn, at least he develops his knight and now gets his rook to the 7th rank. He's trying to get some counterplay going with this a pawn here, but Firouzja just responds to this in a really calm and instructive manner. He goes rook to d8 now, the rook captures here, and he comes down with this check. So the bishop blocks, and now rook to a1 is a really nice move. So you don't have time now to take on b6, or else the other rook comes down and joins the party, and this bishop is actually dropping off the board. So that's why white goes king to g2 here instead, and now we had pawn to c5, shutting out this bishop. We had bishop to d3, trying to activate that one, rook to a2. This pawn is now pinned to the king, so there's a threat to take this bishop, and that's why king f3. Now we had bishop to d4, seeking further exchanges of pieces, which white obliges to. And now bishop e4. Maybe white should have tried rook to d7 here, coming behind this pawn, but then you lose this, which is your one source of counterplay in the position. So instead bishop e4 was played, looking at the queening square. But now this allowed Firouzja to go rook to a3 check, king moved away, and pawn to d3. And now bishop to d5 seeks counterplay here, but it's just not enough at this stage. So the pawn pushes on to d2, allowing the bishop to take here with check, because after king f8, there's really very little for white to do. White dropped the bishop back to d5, trying to set up this windmill tactic against the king, but black queened anyway. We had rook to f7, king to g8, rook to e7, discovered check, but now the queen actually just chops there. Because if the pawn recaptures, you take this one and you're completely winning. And if you take the rook first with check, which Dubov played in the game, after king to f7, pawn captures here, king captures, you're a rook ahead. If you enjoyed this game, then click here to subscribe to never miss another, and see another amazing Firouzja game, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.